All right, everyone, thanks for your patience. We are lucky and happy to be joined today by Jamie Dangler from the United University Professions. She's coming in from Albany to give us a pretty good presentation about the New York State Constitutional Convention. So join me in welcoming Jamie, please.
First of all, I just want to start with some very basic information about the Constitutional Convention, assuming that you may not know much about it, so just so that you know what's coming and what the situation is. On November 7th, next election day, we will be asked as voters in New York State whether or not we want to hold a constitutional convention. So you will have the opportunity to vote yes or no on whether to hold a constitutional convention. This is something that needs to be on the ballot every 20 years. So each, we have opportunities to decide whether we want to hold a full-blown convention. Now, first of all, what does the New York Constitution do? It establishes basic organizational structure for state government. It defines the role of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch of the New York State government. And it establishes the fundamental rights that we enjoy as citizens of New York State. Most of us probably haven't read the Constitution. It's a very lengthy document, and I would certainly urge you to do that. And I can give you some references for how you can get hold of information about what's in the Constitution. Now, I think the first question I want to address with you is how can we change the Constitution? Because again, we're being asked whether we should have a constitutional convention. That would certainly be one way to make changes to the Constitution, but it isn't the only way. There are actually two different ways to change the New York State Constitution, any aspect of it. So first of all, the Constitution can be changed through the legislature, through the legislative process. It can be changed by passage of individual bills by two successive legislatures. So in other words, if we want to change, and if we want to make an amendment to a particular part of the Constitution, that can go up before the legislature. If the legislature passes it in one session, it would have to be brought up in a subsequent session. So it takes passage in two separate sessions of the legislature. Nonetheless, it is possible, and it has been done many times. All right? The second way is to hold a constitutional convention, and if you hold a constitutional convention, then the entire Constitution is put on the table for potential amendment. So let me give you a little bit of information about how those two processes have worked in our past. Now, the first process, changing parts of the Constitution through the legislative process, has been used 200 times in New York State since 1894, so it's not that unusual. The last times it was used are in our very recent history. It was used in 2013 when we amended the New York State Constitution to pass casino gaming provision. We also passed an amendment that would allow sale of specific tracts of Adirondack Park land that were previously protected from that. It was also used in 2015 to create an independent commission on redistricting and make some other changes to election districts. And it was also changed in 2015 to allow the legislature to go paperless. Before this amendment, legislative bills had to go through a very particular process which required the publication of bills in paper. That was changed, and that has actually saved a lot of money in the legislative process. So again, using the legislative process has occurred many, many times with reference to very specific amendments to the Constitution. Now, the second process, of course, is to have a constitutional convention, and that allows for much wider modifications and potentially a full rewrite of the Constitution. Everything can be put on the table. And that process has been used 9 times in New York State's history. It was last used in 1967, and I'll talk a bit about the 1967 7 process, because it may give us some insights into the issues that we might want to raise and think about today with regard to what we want to consider before we go to the polls in November to decide what our vote will be. Now, let me give you the voting timeline for our current period. So again, whether to have a constitutional convention will be on the ballot on November 7th. You vote yes or you vote no. And I want to point out to you that referendum ballot will be on the back of the ballot, and we're concerned about that because people may miss it. So that's an important thing to keep in your mind. Now, if the state of New York's voters decide to have a constitutional convention, then the next step will be in November of 2018, the following year. That would be when we would vote on selection of delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And then, if the timeline proceeds as would typically be expected, whether to accept or reject any amendments that the convention would propose would occur the following year. So that would be in November of 2019. So we're looking at a few years if, in fact, we decide in November to have a convention. Delegates selected the following year, the convention would then operate, do its work, and then any amendments that are proposed would be on the ballot in November of 2019. Now let me talk about delegate selection and how this works. A New York State Constitutional Convention would have a total of 204 delegates. And the way it works is the following. There would be 3 delegates selected for every state Senate district, okay? And there are 63 Senate districts. In addition, there would be 15 at-large delegates selected. So, altogether, there would be 204 delegates to the state constitution, all right? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the delegate selection process, because I think that is an important issue to think about. We do hear, and I'm sure you will hear more discussion, those who want to have a constitutional convention will be arguing that this is a chance to have a people's convention, to have the people of the state represented. And so I would ask you to think about how the delegate selection process works as you consider that question. Will it be a people's convention? You know, what kind of opportunity does a constitutional convention protect the ordinary citizenry of the state? Here's how it works. And again, 3 delegates are elected from each Senate district. If a potential delegate is from an established political party, Democrat, Republican, they need 1,000 signatures to get on the ballot. Okay? If someone wants to run as a delegate for a Senate district outside of the established political parties, they need 3,000 signatures. So right off the bat, that advantages the established political parties, and clearly they will work to get particular delegates put forth. So that's an issue to consider. At-large delegates, remember there will be 15 of them, require 15,000 signatures on a petition. And there are some restrictions or some guidelines. For example, for the at-large delegates, they have to have at least 100 signatures from half of the congressional districts in the state. So again, it takes a lot to get a delegate petition, and it takes money, it takes time, and it takes help. No single person can do it on his or her own. So again, given the number of delegates, of signatures needed for a petition to be delegate, the advantage given to established political parties, because they need fewer than those running outside of established parties. It's not a process that lends itself to anyone off the street literally having a high likelihood of being able to run for delegate. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Now, let me talk a little bit about the 1967 convention. Certainly, what has happened in the past might give us some clues as to what we might expect going forward, and certainly might help us make up our minds up about whether we want to support a convention or not. Now, we had a convention in 1967, which was actually an off year. There was a vote to have a convention in 1957. The ballot included a vote to have a convention in 67, only 10 years later, for a very particular reason. What happened is that the United States Supreme Court invalidated New York's system of legislative apportionment, and so political leaders presented to the public the possibility of having a convention to deal with this problem. And in fact, the voters voted to have a convention. So there was a convention in 1967. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how the vote to hold the convention went. And I'll rattle off some numbers that you certainly don't have to remember, but there was upwards of 1.6 million people who voted yes, upwards of 1.4 million who voted no. So the difference was about 200,000 votes. But almost 3 million people who voted did not vote on the convention proposition. So again, that's a lesson to us. Far more people did not even vote yes or no than who either voted yes or no. So most people either weren't informed enough, decided not to vote, or maybe didn't see the ballot initiative on the back of the ballot. So that's an important lesson to us. Getting out the vote and educating voters about this is a very important thing. Now I want to talk a little bit about who the convention delegates were. And one of the concerns, and I will be very upfront, the organization that I'm from, United University Professions, which is a labor union, is supporting a no vote. So I'm not going to hide that. I want to be very upfront with you. One of the reasons that we are supporting a no vote is because we are very concerned about the extent to which a convention would simply mirror the existing political apparatuses and give an opportunity to do things to political leaders that might not reflect what the general population may think could happen at a convention. So let me rattle off what the composition of the 67 convention was. There were 88 attorneys, again, a total of total of 186 delegates in 67. 88 were attorneys, 24 were judges. Most of them held some kind of appointed political position within state government. So you had a high representation of people from the legal profession who held some kind of appointed or elected position in the state government already. And so that's very important to keep in mind. There were some others represented. There were actually 13 legislators, 6 union officials, and then all other groups, clergy, farmers, mayors, professors, media professionals. Those all had fewer than 4 people. So most of the convention delegates were attorneys, judges, legislators, and most of the attorneys held some kind of appointed position within state government. Now, we are actually in the process of trying to find out more information about exactly who those delegates were. We don't have that together yet because it's not easily obtained. We actually have to go to library archives to find out who they were. But I will read you just a few statements from published sources of information that have studied the 1967 convention, and I can give you those sources if you are interested in seeing the references. In a book written by Gerald Benjamin, who actually I know is supporting the convention currently, who works at a research center at SUNY New Paltz, He wrote this about the '67 convention. Elections were partisan. Legislative leaders dominated the convention, which was organized on a partisan basis and functioned substantially in accord with legislative rules. Sitting legislators and others in government and industry were heavily represented at the convention. Okay. The League of Women Voters, in an analysis of the 1967 convention published in 1973, said this: some commentators remarked that at least 3/4 of the delegates had served or were serving in some governmental capacities. Others observed that the convention was dominated by the political and governmental establishment. Partisan political affiliation were much in evidence, with 98 of the delegates holding some political office or appointment. All right. And then there are some other estimates of that. Finally, Hank DeLay, who is a widely quoted political analyst, said this about the '67 convention. The delegates were primarily political figures representing almost every level of political office in the state. There were state legislators, judges, mayors, city and town council members, and current and former New York City borough presidents. So again, I think that the documentation is pretty clear that the '67 convention was largely, those who served were largely people who were already well established in the state's political apparatus. They were not common, everyday citizens off the street, if you will. So I think the question for us is, what is the likelihood that a convention in 2017 would be any different? I think that's a very important question for all of us to be thinking about. Now, what were the 1967 convention issues? There were a number of them. Again, the legislative apportionment issue that I mentioned before. But there was also a desire to streamline New York's court systems, to lower the voting age from 21 to 18 at the time, and to repeal the Blaine Amendment. And that's one that I will flag for you because it is one of the most important ones for my organization, for United University Professions. The Blaine Amendment is the amendment to the Constitution that prohibits public money from being used to provide basic funding for religious schools. Now, the '67, and I'm sure you know that's a very hot topic today with the expansion of charter schools, which are not specifically religious schools, but nonetheless the question of how much public money should go to base funding for schools that are not public schools is a very contentious issue in our state. Certainly, some public money goes to private schools to provide bus service and resources for students. But the Blaine Amendment prevents actual base funding for religious schools. During the 1967 convention, the delegates put on the table for voters repeal of the Blaine Amendment. So we are in the current climate where that issue is very much alive. We would expect that there would be a lot of support for using public money to fund private schools. So again, that's of concern to public educators, such as those of us in the United University Professions. So again, that's one of the issues we're very concerned about. Now, the 1967 amendments that were presented by the convention did not pass the voters. Okay, so we had a convention. Many of these things were proposed to be changed, but in the end, the voters turned down the amendments. Now, it has been asserted that one of the major reasons for that is that the convention delegates decided to put all of the amendments up as one block. So it was an up or down vote. Either the voters accepted them all or accepted none. Now, whether to put proposed amendments up as a block, all or nothing, up or down, or whether to put them up as individual amendments, one at a time, each with a separate vote, would be decided by the convention delegates themselves. So we don't know. We have no way of knowing what might happen in a 2017 and beyond, constitutional convention. And that, I think, reflects another point that we have to be concerned about, that exactly how a convention operates, what its internal rules are, as well as how the final amendment vote is presented, is decided by the convention delegates themselves. So there's no way to know ahead of time exactly how things will play out and what will come to the voters, or at least what form things will come to the voters. Now, what about current constitutional issues? There are many, again, that my organization is concerned about, and I'll tell you what those are, and I would urge you to, look at what the issues are that potentially could be open to the Constitutional Convention, because you may see others that are of particular interest to you. Well, we are very concerned about the rights currently provided in our Constitution for collective bargaining and unions. We're a labor union. Labor unions are under attack nationally and in many states. So we are very concerned that we might see the Constitution change in a way that could weaken our right to bargain collectively. We have many states in which this is now on the table or has changed. For example, Wisconsin, you may recall the controversy over Wisconsin a couple of years ago. As a result of state changes in Wisconsin, unions in the public sector can only bargain over very, very limited number of things. Wages pegged to inflation and just about nothing else. So the rights to bargain over all issues that potentially unions want to bargain over, including health care and things of that nature, are being curtailed in many states. So we have a lot of concern about what might happen there. Rights to workers' compensation. That has been an issue flagged in our state with criticism of the workers' compensation system. Pensions, again, mostly for public employees. Environmental protections, I think this is a big one. There is some concern that protections in the Constitution for the Adirondack Park and other state and forest lands may be vulnerable because there are many people out there who would like to get access to developing resources in what are currently protected state lands. So if you are an environmentalist, you may have some concerns about what could happen there. Again, in the education realm, in addition to the possibility of the Blaine Amendment being challenged, again, which prevents public money from being used for basic funding for religious schools, the other concern we have is that the Constitution establishes the role for the Board of Regents, which is essentially the education policy-making body for the state. A former governor proposed eliminating the Board of Regents and lodging education policy-making decision in the executive branch in the governor. Others have talked about that, so we're a bit concerned about that. We certainly don't think a change in that direction would benefit the state. You want the governor to have more power, perhaps exclusive power over education policy. Currently, the Board of Regents is appointed by the legislature, so we as a public have some avenue to weigh in through our legislators. So that's a concern in terms of education. A budget role for the state legislature. It's also been proposed by some that the budget be decided by the executive branch alone. Currently that doesn't happen. The governor proposes his budget, the Assembly and the Senate of the state have to agree. So it's a three-way deliberation with the public able to potentially influence what happens through their legislators. So So these are things that are not just theoretically possible. There are discussions out there. There have been groups promoting some of these changes. So I think we have to think about the possibility that they could end up on the table at a constitutional convention. And there are many, many other things in the Constitution. Requirements for the state to provide for basic social welfare needs, and many other things. So I think one thing to think about is that currently the New York State Constitution provides us with many rights, many benefits, many entitlements. So the question is, we may want to see some things change, certainly, but the question is, do we need a full constitutional convention, and might there be some risks there that we don't want to take as a public? I think that's an important question to ask yourselves as you're thinking about the vote. Another issue is the cost of a convention, again, particularly since we can amend the Constitution through the legislative process. The conservative estimates right now are that it would cost between 50 and 100 million to run a constitutional convention. And those are conservative estimates. There are estimates that are higher out there, but I think that's the basic one that we see.
What's that cost? Why would it cost so much?
Okay, first of all, delegates are paid, okay, and the money that they get is pensionable, okay? So and that's another reason why there's concern about the number of, at least in the past, the number of legislators, judges who are already paid a state salary. It's essentially a double dip. They would keep their state, whatever they're paid, and then they would get a second salary, which is pensionable. So the cost of the delegates is one thing. All of the administrative costs and staffing costs. Another thing that actually would be a little different this time is in '67 and before, constitutional conventions were held in the New York State Assembly chambers. They cannot be held in the Assembly chambers anymore because the legislative session runs through June now usually, so it's a longer legislative session than in the past. So they're going to have to pay for space, for convention space, meeting room space, etc. So there are many costs, not the least of which are salaries and staffing needs. Okay, good question. So why are, and again, there are many people promoting a constitutional convention, and it's important to look at why they are promoting a convention. My perspective, and I certainly invite you to look at what's out there and the growing debate that's happening, but my perspective is many people who want a convention, including some well-established groups, are asserting that a convention is important and necessary to deal with particular issues, ethics reform, for example. And I think that it's very important to understand that those are real issues that are very important to people. But I think the question, at least in my mind, is what is the likelihood that if in fact we have a convention, we have convention delegates that mirror the existing political apparatus, that we're going to be more successful dealing with those basic issues in a convention than we are in the legislature. I think that's important. The other issue, I think, is whether or not viewing a constitutional convention possibility through the lens of single issues makes sense, when in fact everything potentially is on the table. Someone's gonna
the delegate election process next year, is that a regular partisan process?
I think it will be, yes. I think it will be because the established political parties have the upper hand in selecting delegates and will play a large role in promoting them. Is that what you meant?
Well, well, there are two questions. Number one, in November, let's say Joe runs, let's say there's going to be a convention, Joe runs as a delegate. Does he run as Joe Driscoll, candidate for delegate, or does he run as Joe Driscoll with a D next to his name?
It would depend on whether it would depend, there will be delegates with both. In other words, the established parties will put up their delegates in each senatorial district, and then there could be at-large.
Right,
Yes.
okay. And so there would be primaries as well? There
Yes.
could be.
Yes,
There could be.
yes,
All
yes,
right.
yes. So actually, there will be party delegates in each senatorial district, and there can be independent delegates as well.
Like a regular election.
And then there will be at-large delegates, the 15, yes.
And did you just vote for the top three in November? You vote for the top three in November. You vote for the top three for Senate district and the top 15 for at-large.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly how it appears on the ballot. I don't know exactly how it will appear, but I think what you said is generally the spirit of it. Every senatorial district has to elect 3 delegates, and then the state has to elect the 15 at-large delegates. Yeah, yeah. Good question. Yes?
What are at-large delegates?
They would be people who wouldn't be from a specific senatorial district. They would represent the state. So again, you've got 3 delegates from each Senate district, and then in addition to that, there will be 15 elected from all over the state that are not from a particular district, that are at large. Does that make sense?
Like the governor runs at large.
The governor runs at large. That's a good, yeah, Wendy's point. The governor runs at large. Everybody elects the governor. So we will have, we will have candidates each of us, when we go to the polls, will elect candidates from our district, our Senate district, and then we will also be able to elect a slate of candidates who are representing the state as a whole. They may not be from our Senate district. Okay. All right. So, again, a couple of things about the convention. The issue of what will happen at the 2017 election. Again, I think that in addition to making our own decisions as individuals or with groups that we are a part of about whether we want to vote yes or no, we also have to be concerned about voter turnout and about whether people understand that there's a convention referendum on the back of the ballot. So that's really very important. 2017 is an off election year. Voter turnout is typically very low in off years, right? And that's why getting out the vote is a very important endeavor, I think, for any of us who are concerned about what may happen with this vote. I think one of the concerns that certainly my organization has is that because we know this is a highly politicized process, there will be a lot of big money brought in to mobilize people to vote, to mobilize them to vote in particular ways, to elect delegates a year later, etc. And so I think that's something that we have to be concerned about. In the past, the numbers of people who have voted on a constitutional convention are relatively low, and we have to be concerned about that as well. So let me kind of lay out for you what I think some of the hot issues are. Again, we are very concerned that people may decide to vote yes or no, either way, on the basis of a single issue. And again, I would argue that it's not the best way to approach the whole thing, but nonetheless, that's likely to happen. We know that those who are promoting a convention have been listing many, many issues that they know are of concern to voters in this state. Those include gun rights on both sides of the issue. You know, whether you are in favor of the SAFE Act or opposed. There are groups out there saying this is your chance to get what you want. Again, opposition to unions is a large one. We know that. We know that the efforts to weaken collective bargaining are very strong around the country, and there are certainly pockets of that in the state. So we know that that will be a big one. Albany corruption, and I think we can all relate to that. There are many groups that are promoting the convention as a way to clean up Albany, to deal with ethics reform. And you're going to hear quite a bit about that. And also groups who are promoting greater public resources for private education. So I think those are among the big ones. There are some others as well. I've seen things coming from groups that have said, this is the way to legalize marijuana. It's the way to clean up our air and water. It's a way to guarantee everybody access to health care, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we just need to be careful and to scrutinize those arguments. Not only in terms of whether these single issues are the way we should think about the Constitutional Convention, but also in terms of gauging what's really going on in the state and what may be more or less likely outcomes on any of these issues. And again, any of these issues are things that we can address through the legislature and through the legislative process. It's not easy. I know that people are very frustrated about ethics reform, but I think we have to think very seriously about the broader picture of what a convention would involve. Okay. Now, I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the backdrop on the national level, because I think that is an issue. Yes, you want to jump in?
So I understand the concern about a convention opens a great deal of risk, right? Because we're essentially reconsidering everything from the ground up.
Yep.
But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the process for passing anything that's proposed at that convention looks like. Because obviously, what the delegates decide there does not become codified in law, right?
Yes.
So it's still, whatever their recommendations are, is still subject to vote by the people of New York State. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that subsequent process looks like and what it actually takes for the recommendations of the Constitutional Convention to be passed? Is it, simple majority vote on, again, I know you mentioned they could put it up in one block or as individual items, and how you assess that piece of it in your risk calculation?
Yeah. It is a simple majority of those who vote, and again, we're concerned about that because voter turnout, number one, you've got many levels on which to be concerned for any of the votes. For the vote to have a convention, to have delegates, and then as you're saying, whether to accept or reject whatever amendments come out of the convention. So voter turnout is number one concern because it's a simple majority of those who vote. Okay, so there is no other rule that would provide us with any kind of safeguards in terms of really representing more than a simple majority of voters. And I think if I'm reading your question correctly, and please ask me to elaborate further if I'm not, we will get, if we have a convention, if there are proposed amendments, we will get on the ballot a yes or no vote, either as a block or individual amendments. But I think part of your question certainly makes me think about what is the likely process between when convention amendments are proposed and when we get to the polls. And I think the partisanship, the extent to which there is likely to be major external funding. And I'm going to talk in a minute about some of the groups that are pushing for constitutional conventions, not just in New York State, and not even mostly in New York State, but nationally and in other states, and where that money is coming from. So I think we have to be concerned. There is going to be lobbying of not only public officials, but of the public. There are going to be major media campaigns trying to get people to to vote one way or another. Now, we're used to that. That happens in the legislative process as well. So I think my point is just that that's what we can expect. And I think part, at least for me and for my organization, our concern is to look at where the money is coming from already to fund support for a convention and for conventions in other states. And I can get to that in a minute. Yeah, I think you know, yeah.
Do you mind if I chime in with an observational response
Yes.
from past experience? When stuff is presented as amendments, I have seen some of the good government groups who say, well, it's not really dangerous because if they present something that's objectionable, the voters will turn it down, like they did in 1967. To which I respond, there have been some amendments to the Constitution and other referenda in the past couple of years that have been presented to the voters, and the fine print is terrible, but it has a positive enough spin that it tends to pass. Like the redistricting reform was a transparent admission by the Republicans of, oh wait, this is our last time to play, this is our last time to mess around. No more partisan redistricting. Democrats, you don't get a chance. And most voters went, and most voters were like, that seems nice. Or there was a land giveaway in the Adirondacks a couple of years ago that was presented as a useful transfer, but it wasn't. It was a giveaway, and it still passed. And then then you've got the IEC. So we New Yorkers have a nasty habit of voting for this frighteningly right-wing stuff that presents itself as middle-of-the-road / common sense. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, we should take a break and then come back to this conversation. I think it would be good to hear what others have to say, because I think this is exactly the kind of discussion we need to have. What do we think is really the reality that we're facing out there in the political